we'll see what happens. But I want to welcome you all here. You can see I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to Zoom technologies, but we have a critical mass here, folks, and I'm just so pleased to see everybody. I know some of you and others are new to me, and I'm just like to welcome you to this first in a three-part series that's currently in play. We've done a couple of these over the last few months, and we're starting them more formally. And I put a link into the chat box to the Co-Design Commons, and that's the fount of this effort. The Co-Design Commons is a nonprofit initiative in Indiana associated with Commons Planning Incorporated in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a nonprofit planning company run by Scott Ball and interested in applying the notion of the commons to urban planning. And the purpose of the Co-Design Institute is to develop our capacity to design with rather than for older adults. And that has to do with the design of environments and also services and technologies, all of which we feel can benefit from the partnership between older adults and designers from early on in the design process and throughout the design and implementation phase. So that's the purpose of the Co-Design Commons. One of the things that we want to do is create a national dialogue about the importance of co-design and its the capability of older adults to be engaged in the design process. And I'm very pleased today to, I should say my name is Phil Stafford, and hope you have a chance to visit the Co-Design Commons website perhaps after this is over, and subscribe to our newsletter, or pass along your comments about today's session. So with that, I want to introduce a very good friend of mine and colleague, Zach Benedict. And Zachary is a principal with MKM Architecture Plus Design in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a very progressive architecture firm that has scads of experience working in the field of aging and design, and with particular respect to the built environment and urban planning. Zach's focus is, actually goes beyond the built environment because he thinks much more broadly, also as a thinker and a philosopher and a sociologist about design for people and design with people. As a principal in the firm, he manages numerous projects ranging from critical access hospitals to public libraries. In addition to his architectural work, Zach manages the firm's research initiatives and hosts Health is Membership, a video series by MKM exploring the connection between placemaking and well-being. And I may have been the person to be privileged to turn Zach on to the work of Wendell Berry, who is the author of a wonderful essay called Health is Membership. And so I'm looking forward to, I didn't know this until today, so I'm really looking forward to that series. Zach and I met halfway between Bloomington and Muncie, Indiana, a number of years ago. And it's been a productive and a delightful relationship since then. Zach has become one of the leading voices in the lifetime community movement, focusing on the socioeconomic benefits of age-friendly neighborhoods and the health benefits. He's lectured nationally and internationally on this and other topics. And in acknowledgement of his work, the American Institute of Architects recognized him with the Young Architect Award not too long ago. And also Ball State University's College of Architecture and Planning, a wonderful school, awarded Zach the Alumni Award for Outstanding Achievement. And he is the youngest individual to ever receive this award. So I've been looking forward to today's presentation, and I'm going to turn the podium over to Zach, who has his first slide in place. I was going to say, if you have questions or comments, let's use the chat room, because I'm not certain if I have the capability of unmuting people. We have a small enough group that we perhaps could do that. But in the meantime, let's use the chat room for your questions and comments. And we may be able to come back to that at the end. Thank you. Zach.
Thank you so much, Phil. So Phil and his group asked me to see if I could muster up a talk on design for a livable lifetime community. So my hope was, in some ways, talk a little bit about some things that our firm is working on that's new to us, or things that are keeping us up at night, but also hopefully frame this in a way that we can end this this session with maybe some good discussion and some questions. So. MKM has been around for about 40 years. We're an architecture and design firm focused on trying to understand the intersection between health and independence. And that's really in a lot of ways how we qualify what constitutes good design. But maybe a better way to explain it is, we really like this quote by Wendell Berry from that essay, Health is Membership, where Wendell says, "I believe that community in its fullest sense, a place in all its creatures, is the smallest unit of health, and that to speak of the health of an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms." The reason I think that's such a powerful phrase is it really sets the stage for understanding health as something that is contextual. So as architects, especially, we pride ourselves in being in the context business. But whenever we're talking about the design, development, or management of a community or neighborhood, it really needs to focus on that context. And within that context, understanding how we can form these more cooperative structures that we refer to often as neighborhoods. That idea of cooperation isn't unique to humans. You see it all over nature in all social animals. My favorite example is these aquatic car washes, where fish will set up stations where turtles and sharks can come and get their shell or their teeth cleaned. And if this was an example of humans, we talk about how altruistic everyone is, and there was a not-for-profit and we were helping serve somebody or marginalized population. But in nature, this is really seen as a cooperative model. Everyone in this photo is providing some value, and the whole system is based on that reciprocation. When a shark does it, he could very well eat the fish, but in doing that, he loses his dentist. So understanding how that cooperation can impact our sense of understanding what a functioning community is, I think is something that can oftentimes get lost in these discussions. If we look at a neighborhood of people with the same objectivity that we analyze a school of fish, I think we'd quickly see just how much our ability to cooperate with others can impact the quality of life for ourselves and those around us. Cooperation in a lot of ways is the currency of the human species. We're hardwired to cooperate for the good of ourselves and the tribe. Matt Ridley wrote a really good book, I thought, called The Origins of Virtue, where he says, society works not because we have consciously invented it, because it is an ancient product of our evolved predispositions. It is literally in our nature. We are, misanthropes notwithstanding, unable to live without each other. Even on a practical level, it is probably 1 million years since any human being was entirely and convincingly self-sufficient, able to survive without trading skills for those of his fellow humans. And I think that's a powerful thing not to forget, especially when we're talking about what the future of livable communities looks like. Is we're looking at that in a more plural sense, understanding it as a platform for cooperation, not necessarily an opportunity for individuals to thrive. One of the things that I think is a key component of the discussion is to try to understand the social determinants of health. And you're starting to see this permeate a lot more of the placemaking literature and research. But for a long time now, we've known that your zip code has much more impact on your health and well-being than your genetic code. Your access to quality health care has little to do with your social determinants of health. What really does impact that are the decisions that impose on your everyday routine. So social environmental factors or your individual behaviors. And in that way, the built environment becomes a behavioral system. Where you live changes how you live, and how you live shapes how well you can live, you and your tribe. And this zip code analysis, this idea that health is contextual to the built environment, it really shows itself when we start looking at the health and well-being of geographic areas. So Gallup Wellbeing, for a couple of years now, has issued these reports on the wellness of individual states and larger metropolitan areas. The lighter the color in this example, the less well the state is. So you can kind of see that kind of circle there in the middle, affectionately referred to as the Midwest, that traditionally hasn't scored well in this setting, really trying to shape and articulate what kind of quality of life those communities are imposing on their residents. And it forces us to have an honest and transparent discussion with ourselves to understand how can we change this? How can we address this in a real systemic way, that we're not just focusing on case-by-case examples, but having a much larger global shift in how we're understanding what constitutes an effective community development strategy. One of the things I think we need to get better at is understanding what we mean when we say something like well-being. Gallup measures it across 5 indicators. There's purpose, liking what you do each day and having motivation to achieve your goals. 2 is social well-being, having supportive relationships and love in your life. 3rd is financial well-being, managing your economic life to reduce stress and increase security. 4 is community well-being, liking where you live, feeling safe and having pride in the place you call home. And then the 5th one is finally the actual physical well-being, having good health and enough energy to get things done. How those 5 elements overlap is how we can try to begin to understand well-being. And each one of those takes on different variables, different strategies that can work with each other, but also can work against each other if they're not legitimized. The other thing that's important within this discussion is to understand these 5 indicators, but across the age spectrum. You know, these things mean very different things in different stages of your life. The reason that's important is, and I think most here know, is just how rapid our aging population is growing, and understanding how that impacts this idea and sense of well-being, and how can we understand the urgency of these issues as it relates to community development. Common myth is that, you know, the senior living industry is going to reconcile all these concerns and accommodate everyone that's in need of additional services and support. Most research will say that they're going to accommodate about 5% of the market, which means 90 to 95% of older adults would rather not engage in conventional senior services. So again, pushing that to the responsibility and burden to the community to understand how they're going to re-engage this shifting demographic in a meaningful way that not only helps the quality of life of them as an individual, but allows them to provide meaningful value to the community at large.
Zach, could I interrupt for a sec?
Yes.
I think some people maybe have trouble seeing the content on your slides, and it's been suggested that maybe if you stop screen share and then start it again.
Let's try it.
No, I can see it. But
How about now?
No problem. Sexy lady.
Is that better?
Jenny?
You gotta unmute me. Oh, there, I can unmute. Yay, I can talk. Oh my gosh, I'm so lucky. I was having such a hard time. So what's going on, Zach? When you share, there's a green box. And for me, it's kind of slid off. I see the 2 people and just 2 arrows. So I don't see the other side of your screen on mine. And okay, so maybe try full screen again and see if it will do it again. I don't know. Yeah, see, I can, does anybody else have any comments, or is it just me? Like, I can show you what I'm seeing. It's right now white with half of a circle and 2 arrows. And I just see network, support network. So it feels like it's too big for my screen, but I'm on a 27-inch Mac. Maybe I can reduce it. Let's go escape.
I'm getting a couple of messages from people that say it's fine.
Okay, good. All right then.
If yours is fine, will you please smile? Okay, good. Okay, thanks. Sorry for the interruption, Zach.
Yeah, let's get it back up here.
Are we going to the door today?
Hmm?
Are we going to the door today?
No, papi, no.
All right, we're back.
I think we're okay.
So one of the ways to look at this is think of health and well-being in this kind of upstream, downstream duality. The conventional healthcare system has really tended to operate downstream in a reactive way. People get sick, they receive care. People's acuity or independence change, they receive support. But as we think about this more as a global concern, we're starting to try to understand how we can push some of these discussions and disruptive innovations further upstream to better understand how we can design, plan, and operate communities in a way that they cultivate healthy living as opposed to developing strategies to react to an unwell population. One of the things that I think is increasingly absent from these discussions that I want to talk about tonight is this idea of understanding the importance of face-to-face contact, relationships, and communication. And there's a mounting evidence that a rich network of face-to-face relationships creates a biological force field against disease and longevity. And trying to understand what that means and how can we leverage and incentivize it in the way we think about community development. If I look at the indicators that reduce your chances of dying the most of the things on this list are things you likely would be able to guess. Clean air, vaccines, exercise, don't smoke, don't drink. But by a large factor, the first and second most notable strategies for reducing the chances of dying are this idea of close relationships and social integration. And it's not a trivial thing to understand what these two things can provide, not only to our longevity, but our quality of life. So we look at those two things. Close relationships, to clarify, are those people that you can call for real support. They're the ones that you traditionally would consider your loved ones, the ones that actually would come pick you up at the airport if you called them. And that bonded relationship with those close individuals is a core group of people that you rely on for support and care. The second is this idea of social integration, which measures how much you interact with people as you move throughout your day and how many people you talk to with both your weak and your strong bonds. Not just the people in these close relationships, but a broader sense of your social network. So they're related, but they are very, very different things. And we have to understand how both of those types of relationships constitute some sort of experience and sense of belonging in your everyday routine. The lack of either really starts to evoke this sense of loneliness in individuals. And that loneliness is becoming an increasing concern. If we really gave it the attention it deserves, I think you could probably classify loneliness as a national emergency, as an epidemic. And the statistics, even before the COVID pandemic, were starting to become increasingly alarming. Around half of Americans have meaningful in-person social interactions, meaning half of us don't, such as having extended conversations with a friend or spending quality time with a family member on a daily basis. Most of those individuals have that with their spouse, meaning they're one funeral away from being completely isolated and alone. We've all kind of had a sense of this in a different way over this last year, but it has become one of those discussions where this idea of loneliness now becomes a guiding principle in how we're understanding the success or failure of our communities at the neighborhood level. This feeling of loneliness is an interesting thing. It's not just your brain playing tricks on you. It's an evolved warning in your mind. It's served as an eternal alarm. Feeling lonely is as painful as being wildly hungry, and it's by design or by evolution. Since the human brain evolved at a time when social cohesion meant survival, while social isolation meant starvation or certain death, our sense of loneliness is intended to send a biological signal to those that you've been separated from the group, and that you're in danger, and it's not something you should take lightly. And that's a hard feeling to dismiss. And for a lot of us, it's becoming an increasingly common feeling. One of the reasons is because of the way we have built our environments. The amount of people in this country living in a one-person household has increased substantially, going from about 12% of the population to almost 30%, with over 35 million people living in a home by themselves. You could use that as a way to tell a story of independence and privacy, or you could look at it in a completely different lens. 36 million people live alone, and existence that, and given a different context, is only reserved for the most severe forms of punishment in solitary confinement. And we know a lot about the impacts of solitary confinement on prisoners, but you rarely see that as part of the discussion to talk about the health and well-being of a neighborhood. Studies have shown when we look at solitary confinement that a diffuse slowing of the brain waves occur after 1 week. Some prisoners who only social contact was a food tray shoved through the slot of the door, maybe similar to a Meals on Wheels program, become catatonic or developed autistic features, while others regressed, having panic attacks and becoming increasingly excessive. I don't think this is a far stretch for how some people were living over this last year, and understanding that the built environment in a lot of ways imposed this loneliness on them and their fear that they have now been separated from the group. Over the last couple of years, we've been told by a lot of industry experts that technology would help reconcile this loneliness. What we're finding now is the people that use technology tend to be stereotypically more lonely, meaning that the America's youth is among the loneliest throughout our population. There are some caveats to that. Some technology that actually has facial recognition, like FaceTime, when you actually see a face, has a tendency to trick your brain into thinking you're having face-to-face contact and doesn't evoke such a sense of loneliness. But other things like Instagram and Facebook, where you can't interact in real time with that extended network, only increase your sense of detachment and separation from the group and the fear that you're missing out on things outside of your control and your everyday routine. So how are we going to fix this problem in a meaningful way? One of the ways is to try to rethink how we understand our neighborhoods in a more organizational way. The traditional community was the triangulation of three basic places. First was home, second place was work, and the third place was like the Cheers song where everybody knows your name. I think it's helpful to think of these as also three different types of realms. Home was a realm of privacy. Work was a realm of purpose, whether it was paid or volunteer. And these social hubs were a realm of fellowship. Your sense of belonging and engagement within the community was defined by your exposure to these three different places throughout the day. The second I took away one, you started to feel as though you were detached from a larger group. This is why retirement can be so problematic when there's not a plan of how you're going to regain some sense of purpose within a defined role. The real key here is to try to understand that you cannot reconcile these issues by providing more services. And this has, I think, traditionally been how we've handled problems facing pre-driving teens or older adults, is we've given them a consumer model where you find a service or a person that you trust and they'll provide you something that you need. But we need to look past that and start trying to understand how we can incentivize this idea of a more cooperative model. One that understands that I can trust someone to provide me something as long as they value me to provide them with something as well. And those things don't have to necessarily be equal. What's important here is that there is a mutual sense of value and provision. And this cooperative model is much more in line with how we instinctively understand our role within a community. Groups like AARP are trying to understand this. There's things like the LIvability Index that are trying to measure as best they can some of these scenarios and giving you a sense of a metric. The LIvability Index, you can type any address in the country and give you a score of how livable it is. But it doesn't, I think, yet give the attention to these reciprocal relationships and the true value they can be. Sometimes I think too often these discussions strive to figure out how to create the perfect utopial neighborhood. And what we're striving to be here isn't perfect at all. What we're striving to be is engaged. The priority here is to have a sense of belonging, not perfection. So you think about the relationship between a patron and a waitress at a restaurant. At face value, this could be described as a simple one-sided consumer transaction. But then think of a loyal customer, that patron that comes in every morning to order their usual meal and give their abbreviated thoughts on things like weather and politics. This is different. The food is not the only provision here. His continued dedication as a repeat customer provides a steady, albeit small and modest, financial support for the restaurant. But more than that, they both are providing each other their time, their friendship, and their trust. They are simply using the restaurant as a vehicle to trade those goods. So this is why those social hubs become so important. These reciprocal relationships are essential, not only to the local economy, but our survival as a species. Oftentimes you'll see that referred to as social capital. So we need to get better at understanding the dangers of loneliness and their effects isolation can have on people of all ages and abilities. More importantly, we need to start taking ownership and developing a tribal structure that prioritizes a sense of connectivity and belonging. I think this idea of social capital is dismissed often as a feel-good theory that has no real impact on the measurable success of the tribe, especially in circles surrounding economic development and community planning. But it depends on how you measure success. We know that people that consider themselves engaged in their neighborhoods tend to not ever have a real sense of loneliness. They do feel continually engaged. And by the result of that, traditionally score higher on things like well-being index. And that's really because of two things. We circle back to this idea of what can reduce your chances of dying most. You have these two things, these close relationships and social integration. Another way to call close relationships is this idea of bonded relationships. This is that core group, those people that you love that are a key part of your everyday life. But it's also your exposure to these bridge relationships, this social integration within a larger context. And you need physical spaces to develop, sustain, and care for these relationships with different individuals. And it's amazing what the impact of these relationships can have on your physical health. My favorite example is women with a large network of friends are 4 times more likely to survive breast cancer than those with sparser connections. That to me is amazing, to think that friendship in some ways can save your life. It's even more disconcerting when you think about how many people live alone, and understanding that as populations are rapidly aging and we know that some of these health issues and disability concerns are going to increasingly grow, it becomes extremely important, and I think terrifyingly urgent, to understand how we can make sure people consider themselves engaged in a social network. But that's no easy task. Belonging is the priority here. We need to feel as though we are part of the group, and we are continually seeking out tribal identities that support us. Our happiness often is a result of that sense of belonging. So you think of happiness almost as the opposite of loneliness. It's that feeling that washes over us when we feel as though we belong, as we're part of a broader group. Whether it's an inside joke or a neighborhood block party, that sense of happiness identifies to us in our brain that we're somewhere where we belong, we're within a group, and we can provide value there. Jonathan Haidt wrote this book called The Happiness Hypothesis, where he kind of gives this anecdotal equation for what makes us happy. And I think it's interesting. He says, happiness is really just a culmination of biological set points. Some people are happier than others, life conditions, and voluntary activities. This equation for this community attachment is complicated, but the result is simple. It's directly connected to our perceptions of how well we belong within the world around us. So when we talk about these things like life conditions and voluntary activities, we have to think about that across the lifespan and within the built environment we're imposing on people. Those two things dramatically change your ability to have these voluntary activities or how you perceive and define certain life conditions. People like Projects for Public Spaces have done a wonderful job, I think, of defining what a good place is, a physical place. And they'll provide some of these helpful diagrams to show that all good places are sociable, active, accessible, and comfortable. But it doesn't yet, I think, take into that fundamental factor of what it's like to be accepted and thrive within that group setting. This is just giving you that physical platform to have those relationships. We're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this was really, I think, an interesting discussion on how we could define an ideal way to achieve self-actualization. And I don't mean to get into the weeds here with this, but it's interesting to understand how much thought has been put into the idea of self and how we can excel as individuals, but seemingly little of the same energy spent at the community level understanding group actualization. So how can we better understand the process for such a thing, this idea of prioritizing the success and the health and well-being of the tribe? And how can that energy and dedication to understanding that change how we think about the design, planning, and development of neighborhoods? A lot of times you'll hear these discussions around diversity and inclusion, and in some ways almost assuming that they're the same thing. But then there's this quote that you see often when we talk about this topic, that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And I always thought that was interesting, not only because I think it's a nice way to differentiate the two, but it also sets up the difference in a linear way. One has to happen before the other. So then we began to think here at the firm, what is the result of that? Both of those really don't talk about the individual's behavior. They're both the group. The group invites you to the party. The group asks you to dance. And the result is, I think, in belonging is when you can dance like nobody's watching. That's the whole goal is you get a chance, you see a platform, and you can behave in a way that you couldn't as an isolated person outside the group. So then it became kind of this three-step process that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about. So if you keep this analogy of dancing, right? So the first step is diversity, being asked to the party. Second is inclusivity, being asked to dance. And the third is equality, dancing like nobody's watching, feeling like you're a member and belong within a larger group. Then we started thinking, well, there probably is an intermediate step in between both of these. If I got being asked to the party, before I can dance, I got to get to the venue. And once I've been asked to dance, I got to find a partner in the dance floor before I can start dancing like nobody's watching. And this started to become this kind of five-step process, which each one of these topics, diversity, equity, inclusivity, reciprocity, and equality, all played a specific role in a specific order. And then we thought, well, how can that help us think about the neighborhood? And selfishly, as architects, what is our role in helping people through this process? Well, they're interconnected, I think. You know, diversity can be measured by the group's ability to accept new members. Equity really is measured by your ability to allow as many people as possible to engage on their own terms, people of all ages and abilities. Once they can engage, then they can develop some system of trust, especially in how they manage the commons, how they manage that group, that neighborhood. Once there is some system of trust, then these individuals have some ability to contribute, right? They can develop these reciprocal relationships. And once you can develop those over a period of time, you really do begin to cultivate a sense of belonging. Then we thought, well, that's really fascinating. How do we differentiate where placemaking strategies can happen and when social structures have to take the lead? So we started looking at this diagram on two axes. The y-axis, up and down, the top is more influenced by the group dynamics, where the bottom is influenced by the physical environment. So as an architect, placemaking strategies do a wonderful job of helping us understand how we can increase people's ability to engage and also to contribute. The gap between those two, though, is this sense of the group developing some system of trust. And as an architect, I can't help you there. I have to understand how I can nudge that discussion and that behavior for the group, that once they trust, then they can learn how to use these platforms to allow people to contribute. But there is this little step, this little baton toss of that. The other axis is this left to right axis, where we start with this heritage, the legacy and tradition of a place and a group, that transitions into redefining its culture in this kind of trust category, its rituals and rules, all the way to evoking a sense of community with its values and its definition of unity as different members come on board and begin to feel like they belong. This is a feedback loop. The second everyone feels like they belong, they redefine the heritage of a place. And you go through it again. And when we talk about this idea of group actualization, what we're really thinking about is how many iterations can I go through this process, helping not only redefine myself and my ability to contribute, but redefining the group, its identity, its brand, and its behavior. So the question is, can we develop a discussion, a strategy, a common understanding of how our communities can elaborate on this dynamic in a way that really reconciles and I think respects the natural instincts of us as humans. You know, going back to that idea, if we treated a neighborhood of people like a school of fish, we'd acknowledge and understand and appreciate how they interact with each other. And the development of these communities would simply be a response to that in a way that is solely focused on the actualization of the group. So that first step, diversity requires acceptance. The impact of the historical context and brand of that place has on defining the cultural barriers for allowing engagement. So this is that most upstream discussion where you talk about the impact of the heritage, the systemic racism, whatever it is that impacts my perception of that group's willingness to accept new members, shapes, molds, and bottlenecks its ability to embrace a more diverse user group. But if I can get that, if I can increase that, then equity requires engagement. You know, I'm getting to the venue now. So how do I establish a sense of equity and elevate people's ability to engage? This is where things like ADA legislation, form-based codes, zoning can play a huge role in understanding how we can increase equity across an equal playing field and elevates people's ability to engage the world around them. Once we've kind of gotten through that, you can talk about this idea that the management of the group empowers individuals of all ages and abilities to cultivate a reputation through repetitive provisions of value. This idea that inclusivity requires some sense of trust. And this is what we're talking about, and it happens at all different scales. You know, the second my 10-year-old son can mow the grass, do I have a neighbor that's going to encourage him to come mow his? Can he feel like he's contributing to the neighborhood in a meaningful way? Because once he does, he has more confidence to take on more challenges. But he needs that platform. He needs a neighborhood where a neighbor is willing to meet him in the front yard, that sees him mowing out of his front porch and understands he might be ready to do that here, and I'm going to go reach out and ask. Because when that occurs, and this group dynamic allows individuals to build these sustainable relationships at various scales, that they consist of mutual benefit through these valued contributions, both large and small. Because what we know is this idea of reciprocity requires contribution. It understands that for everyone to feel like they are contributing, they have to acknowledge the fact that it's a give and take, that they're helping each other, that it's not a charity. And you can measure the way the built environment allows this to occur through these things like a livability index, placemaking strategies, walkability, all that really increases and is intended to incentivize this idea of repetition. And without repetition, you can't build a reputation. So you need these common, frequent, repetitive interactions with people within the group to develop a sense of relational trust to provide value. And this becomes critical. And it's why livability indexes are so geared towards prioritizing density, because the biggest benefit of density is the frequency of social interaction. This all results in this idea of a sense of belonging, which is really the baseline of how we understand equality, right? The group consistently acknowledges an individual's contributions, resulting in a shared sense of belonging. I now feel like I can dance like nobody's watching because I'm among friends. There's no judgment. I'm part of the group. And in that way, our communities are platforms for cooperation. The sooner we can understand this, the sooner we can improve their ability to foster meaningful relationships and prioritize this sense of belonging. The goal here isn't perfection. The goal is cooperation. So I look at this and it's a busy diagram with a lot going on, but what I think is interesting about this as a framework is it starts to really clearly delineate the difference between these key concepts in a way that the group can understand where it's doing things well and where it's limiting its ability to support the group in a meaningful way. And I think we make these judgment calls all the time. We just don't phrase them within this framework. You know, when you compare two experiences like this, it's easy to talk about the car or the walkability on the slide to the right, but we might take these conversations more seriously We start claiming that the image on the left portrays an environment that limits our capacity to cooperate, reduces our ability to develop reciprocal relationships, and in some way diminishes our sense of purpose. That's a much bolder claim. And it sounds dramatic, but that is precisely what that experience is doing at some level. We're thinking how we can better evaluate how our homes base their ability to foster a sense of belonging, engagement, and trust. Because in this context, that's their primary role. Fortifying our homes doesn't make us safer. Living in reciprocal tribes do. But we don't talk about our homes in that way. Over the last few thousand years, we've evolved into complicated cooperation machines whose sole objective is to utilize partnerships as a survival mechanism. And this machinery is powered by our sense of belonging, engagement, and trust. That's why when we're alone, when we're isolated and nervous about the world around us, we feel overwhelmed. We need that connection, that network of reciprocal relationships that we support and in turn support us. This isn't rocket science. It's not intended to be. We need each other for more reasons than we sometimes care to admit. And we'll be better off the sooner we accept the fact that and start empowering others to accept, to engage, to trust, to cooperate, and ultimately belong. You know, we're in this together. Our responsibility, I think, when we discuss the design, development, and management of a community is to not forget this. And this is the framework that I think moving forward, a lot of communities, especially within the Midwest, dealing with challenges surrounding health and well-being, are going to have to focus. The question is, how can we handle that at a localized level? Questions?
That was wonderful, Zach. Not surprised at all at the depth of your understanding of these issues, and it occurs to me that the forces that threaten those relationships, both bonding and bridging, are economic, often having to do with the health of the economy and the migration effects that come about as a result of economic disasters and natural disasters and so forth. Those certainly threaten relationships. But there are also cultural forces that threaten relationships. And when you were talking about the importance of being yourself, I'm recollecting the insights of my spouse, who taught first grade for years and years and years, and we've experienced this in stores as well, where children at a young age are kind of experimenting with who they are and trying to be themselves, and unfortunately being clamped down upon and prevented from doing that. And you know, we've been in stores where parents say shut up to their kid, or maybe even slap their child because they're being themselves. And I think that carries over deeply in deep ways. And I'm reminded actually of the dance metaphor and our high school dances that we remember, where at least males stood against the wall until the last 15 minutes of the dance, and then worked up the energy and the gumption to go onto the dance floor, and then suddenly discovered how wonderful this is, and the regret we had that we didn't do it 2 hours earlier. And so I think there are these individual elements, but they're not. It's not a question of individual psychology, but individual ways of being that are cultural in character, and not attributable to genetics or personality or psychology. I think in late life, I think older people find themselves sometimes in the same situation, and where they, and I'm speaking for myself here, I'm 72 years old. You begin to wonder about how you're being perceived, and you're a little less likely to let your hair down and be yourself, for fear of being seen as you know, an old crank or a geezer, or whatever. And so I think with both situations, what's at stake is the core of all this is the notion of the relationship. And so it's not, the forces are not individual, nor are they purely social, but the reality has to do with the relationship between an individual and society, or with respect to disability and aging, our individual bodies and the environment in which that body finds itself. That it's that relationship which is the reality that we need to be looking at. And unfortunately, disciplinary thinking in the field of aging doesn't pay much attention to that relationship. It tends to focus primarily on the individual aging body and not on the body within its environment. And I think that's a basic problem. And I'm sorry to make a comment rather than a question, but it's a comment born out of your good thinking.
To extend that discussion of a relationship, I think it has a lot to do with our perceptions of the value we as individuals can provide. It's an easy discussion to have when you talk about, well, the second you can no longer drive, how does that change your everyday routine and what value you can provide to the community? But it's amazing what little things I think these social structures impose on how you perceive your own value. If you interview a whole class full of kindergartners and ask them who in the room can draw, everyone raises their hand, right? If I do that with adults, no one dare raises their hand, because they get judged for not being able to draw really well. What did you mean by that? Dancing's the same way. You ask a 5-year-old if they can dance. All of them think they can dance, and they all can, and they have that elevated sense of value. Somewhere along the way, both from a social structure, but also a physical environment, we've developed these communities that really marginalizes, deviants, non-normal things, and we put them in monocultures. Whether it's older adults go to retirement communities, kids go to a school out in the country, we try to put these pockets of value and use and ability in these different areas, so that if you're almost judged or feel like you're going to be judged if you don't play by those rules. And we're starting to understand just how damaging that can be to the health and well-being of people at the neighborhood level.
Bob has a question, and Bob, I'm trying to. Are you able to unmute? I'm again apologizing for the. I don't know what I've done wrong here, but I'm having trouble unmuting people. But in any case, Bob's question is: are you currently involved in projects that operationalize these concepts in communities? Great question.
We do a lot of work with.
And that's for Zach.
We do a lot of work with life plan communities, continued care retirement communities, talking about how they can redefine what this means, especially through the lens of diversity and value. I have honestly have not yet had this done at more of a community intergenerational scale. Now, we have done things before this, which is different than what I think we're talking about tonight, in trying to understand how things like zoning and development standards can be redesigned to encourage reciprocity. But that's just a small part of what we're, of the much broader topic I just put in front of you.
Well, I'll cite some of your work. You have, with a community in Northwest Indiana, you looked at the template that's occupied by a continuing care retirement community and superimposed that template over the downtown area. And I don't know if the downtown has reacted and incorporated into its planning or not, but it dramatically showed how authentic, real communities on the ground already exhibit some of the features that retirement communities are trying to develop. And The thing about enabling people to occupy real communities is if the community is healthy, they're able to access goods and services and relationships by virtue of their own labor, which means they don't have to pay for that. And I think the thinking that you're exhibiting here has lots of concrete possibilities that should be taken up by the field of urban planning and architecture.
The other thing I'll say is a subset of this discussion is this idea that to achieve any of this, I think you have to rely on key essential institutions. This just doesn't happen by accident. And we do a lot of work with public libraries, and my real passion for public libraries is the fact that I think they have a wonderful ability to help communities with this discussion. They're the last democratic space. It's the last commercial square footage you can walk into without the expectation of buying something. And it has that ability and that almost forgivable municipal brand to really change its mission and its focus to make a concerted effort to increase the neighborhood's diversity, sense of engagement, trust, contribution, and to function as an opportunity incubator in some way. And we do a lot of work with public libraries and rural communities, knowing that they're one of the linchpins to achieve any of this at that scale.
Huzzah! I'm unmuted.
Yay!
Zach, great to see you again after many of these years. And Phil, I'd like to reflect on the fact that it doesn't seem as though you've not let your hair down. I think it's great. Having for a little background for folks on this Zoom, I lived and worked in Indianapolis for 25 years and got to know Phil and Zach and a lot of different wonderful things. I'm now older, fortunately younger than Phil by a year, but it's interesting. I have moved back to New England, to Connecticut, where I grew up. And Zach, it is amazing to me to look at your state by state demographic, because I expected to see Connecticut to be much more open and warm to the kinds of things that would make people feel more connected. And yet what I recognize is that in Connecticut, in New England, for any of you who know it, it is a very independent place. You do not embrace strangers easily. You absolutely must take a long time. For example, for those folks who are in Indiana, the idea of going down the street and saying hello to somebody who's a stranger is sort of tantamount to attacking them. And you know, it's funny. I moved back here because of the many wonderful quality of life things. And yet what I'm now wrestling with is I want to move back to the Midwest, where I find it's far easier to be invited to the dance. And so my surprise and astonishment is that the Midwest seems to be less and less, I'm sorry, I don't remember the term that you were using, but it seems to me, and this is in my observation, and by the way, I just got back on Tuesday from spending a week in Indianapolis, where I go to recharge my batteries of connection.
And I think the Midwest traditionally has done a horrible job trying to leverage that tradition of being and traditionally a collection of communities that are eager to embrace people, and not taking seriously the damaged reputation of being shut down to outsiders can do. You know, Indiana was going to pass the RFRA law. And it, didn't pass, but again, to this discussion, right, it set the tone at the national scale that there's certain diverse populations that weren't welcome in Indiana. And that starts that progression. That process starts there. And you can't improve the downstream strategies without reconciling the fact that now we're here. Now we have to start at this point. And one of the things that I think is interesting with that framework is it's easier to change the downstream things than the upstream things. It's a lot harder to change the heritage of a community than a sense of ritual or tradition. And the Midwest traditionally hasn't done a good job of leveraging that from a marketing and PR standpoint. You know, they do that really well by and large. You go to the outside the Midwest, and all you'll hear is how nice and welcoming and polite we all are. But we don't use that as a way to understand how we can leverage the livability within our communities in a meaningful way.
Well, I say absolutely all the time. It's like when I am in Indiana, and again, I'm not a native Hoosier. You can go up to anybody and stick out your hand and say, "Gosh, I want to be your best friend," and they're like, "Sure." And it's so extraordinary because here in New England, it's like, why would I want that? You've got to prove yourself. And you're right. It's that whole leveraging thing. And I think a lot of it has to do with perhaps the rural communities, the smaller towns where you can be more of a stranger in Indiana than here, where it's just accepted that you're a stranger.
Ham, are you able to unmute Ham Shrestha? She's asked a wonderful question, and so I'm gonna read the question. Congratulations for your creative and mindful presentation. And then she offers her gratitude to you, Zach. She's a PhD student at Northern School of Rural and Northern Health, Laurentian University in Sudbury, Canada. And she says, I am thinking, how could we use your idea or concept to design a community center for Indigenous people with dementia in Northern Ontario for Anishinaabe First Nations, people for social cultural engagement, ceremonies including dance, music for spiritual or emotional wellness. Do you have any idea or thought or experiences? Would you please elaborate if possible?
Hi, good evening. My name is.
Oh, there's Ham.
So very nice to see you, everyone. And I'm so grateful for your wonderful presentation. What I'm expecting, for the long time. So this is a great, the fortune you to attend and learning from you a lot. So I'm now a PhD student, and my research is about the dementia care policy, specifically for the indigenous populations in the northern Ontario of the Canada. So I'm so interested, having this kind of, this kind of, the design for the community center, specifically for the persons with dementia in the indigenous community, specifically for the Anishinaabe First Nations community.
Yeah.
So I'm so grateful, so how should I, this is just my envision, I'm just imagining. I'm thinking, that this is also important, if I could contribute, I could do something.
Zach, do you have any initial reactions?
To develop, the dementia friendly, the community as well.
Part of this framework that we've been thinking through is an effort to try to understand for ourselves what we thought we could impact and what we thought we couldn't as architects. You want to think you can solve all these problems with, you could design your way out of this issue. At least architects think, to hammer every problem looks like a nail. But in in this framework, what I think you can be prescriptive about is understanding how you can develop strategies for the built environment to increase people's ability to engage and contribute. Kind of that step 2 and 4. Steps 1, 3, and 5 aren't as simple. There's other strategies to do that. You know, I think that kind of trust category, talking about inclusivity, really resonates with the work of the likes of Eleanor Ostrom and the management, Common Pool Resources, management of the commons, which is largely non-architectural.
Mhm.
I think there's steps there, and my thinking is that they're all in some way interrelated, and more importantly, linear. One has to happen before the other in some way. But I'm always really hesitant to say that there's a prescriptive strategy to get someone from being an outsider to belonging, like going from all the way through that progression. I just know that I think there's certain steps along the way that as an architect, as a designer, as a planner, that you can help increase the ability for group actualization. But then there's these kind of linchpins in between where the baton has to get tossed, and you're really at the mercy of the social structure and the people managing that.
Yeah.
It's like when we work in rural communities, the best thing about working in small towns is the worst thing about working in small towns, and that 2 or 3 people can make anything happen or kill any idea. Right. And I can't design my way out of that reality. So I can give you strategies. We can change your whole zoning ordinance. But
That's great. Yeah.
as soon as I leave, the CEO of the largest employer says, Zach's an idiot and that's the dumbest idea I ever heard. That's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And there's no sense of trust there.
Well, I think that's a good argument for co-design, and reframing what we call the expertise of architects and other professionals, thinking of them as partners. And 2 other quick thoughts. I wanted to encourage you to go to our co-design Facebook page and post your question. We're building that page. We're hoping to generate some conversation, and it might be a good place to post that question and see what you get. We'll try to share it as widely as we can. And secondly, I wanted to call your attention to the work of Emi Kiyota and her concept of ibasho, which, are you familiar with that?
No, not really.
She's a Japanese American who's done, an architect who has done amazing work helping develop community centers in areas destroyed by the tsunami in Japan. And it's just inspiring work. And you can Google ibasho, IBASHO, and find out more about that, because I think it has direct relevance to the specific project that you're working on and talking about. And since we're over time here, I'm going to have to close our program. Maybe next time we should allow an hour and 15 minutes or something, or an hour and a half. We have 2 programs coming up. One on May 20th on design thinking, and a colleague, John Rasek here at Indiana University, is going to be doing a hour-long session on design thinking. And we have one on June 3rd. A couple of landscape architects actually will be talking about the concept of the memory garden, which is a interest within the dementia-friendly community movement. And Portland, as Alan probably knows, has a wonderful public memory garden, one of 2 in the country. And so that'll be an interesting session as well. And we'll try to develop some more for you.
Thank you so much.
So tell us what you want to talk about also, because this is all about co-design. So help us with that challenge.
Yeah.
And hope everybody has a fine evening. And Zach, thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me.
And Jenny, for your
Thanks so much.
Good to see you, Frank.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.